Welcome to the Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast. I'm Brandon Jaffe. Join us as we explore relationship and mental health issues by weeding out the trends in the mental health industry to uncover what truly works in improving our emotional well-being and relationships. At Inspired Resolutions Counseling, we specialize in providing interventions and resources for families with teens, focusing on topics such as teen mental health, parenting challenges, and family dynamics.
Today I'm going to talk about this really bizarre concept in my mind. A lot of people would disagree with me, but this bizarre concept of dopamine addiction and dopamine cleanse. I think that we live in a world right now where people love the idea of a cleanse, regardless of what research says for your body, etc. And now people are capitalizing on that very trendy word, and they are somehow convincing people that you can solve a lot of your life mental health problems by doing these various dopamine cleanses. And I'm not saying that some of the behaviors and practices aren't good, but the idea of a dopamine cleanse, when somebody presents that to you, it's a sign that they haven't done their research. It's a sign that they don't really know what they're talking about. And again, that's fine. You know what? If there's some sort of life coach that stumbles upon some good habit by utilizing this bizarre concept of dopamine addiction and dopamine cleanse, that's fine. But I think that when it comes to mental health, we need to get rid of some of these unhealthy and incorrect trends, whether it be in a habit that's being put out there, a behavior that's being put out there, or a belief or understanding about something. So I kind of wanted to clear this up. Addiction is something that I've dedicated a lot of my professional life to understanding and helping people with. And so I think that it's important to understand, look, when it comes to addiction, we have been trying to figure out how to beat addiction for many, 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 many years, far before I was ever born. And our understanding of addiction, how do we become so obsessed with something that we can't stop a behavior even though we know it is harming ourselves? The study of that is huge. And there are some people who are going in great directions with it, and there are some people who are kind of off in outer space with it. And so you've got to understand, for instance, when you take drugs, the reason that addiction can be created is because the drugs or the behavior is interfering with the normal way that neurons send and receive signals. So your brain is constantly sending signals through neurotransmitters. For example, when you use drugs like whether it's marijuana or heroin, what's going on is that substance is mimicking the process of neurotransmitters in the brain. What happens is it almost abuses the transportation system for healthy messages like pleasure. When you have a flood of neurotransmitters, or on the other end, you have something interfering with the transportation of neurotransmitters, there is some damage, and sometimes that damage can be healed and sometimes it cannot, but there's this disruption of neurons. And that's, in a very simplistic way, is how you get the effects that you feel with things like drugs. Now, there are some behaviors that when you do it, even eating food becomes a part of this neurotransmitter process in the brain. And food is an addiction. We have foods that disrupt, and the process of repeating certain behaviors is a thing. And there's other reasons that you become addicted to food. You can become addicted to, like I said, drugs. You can become addicted to certain behaviors like sex and gambling. And it all has to do with the way that these neurotransmitters are functioning on a regular basis. Sometimes it's a giant flood or a giant blockage in the moment. And so drugs affect and disrupt at a far greater amount than behaviors and eating food, but there's still an abuse of this process in the brain. When you're talking about drug use and addiction, you're talking about a few parts of the brain that are affected. You're talking about the basal ganglia, which is what's responsible for things like motivation and pleasurable effects. So when you're talking about the basal ganglia, you've got to understand that by abusing that part of the brain, you may become less motivated without the drug. You may have different drives that either spike or reduce in an inappropriate and unhealthy way. The next part is the amygdala. The extended amygdala, that plays a role in stressful feelings like anxiety, irritability. It is the part of the brain that helps you regulate those feelings and thoughts that are kind of the subconscious. It's that part of the brain where it's definitely affecting the decisions that you make. It's definitely affecting how you process things around you, but it's kind of in the background. When you lose the motivation because of, again, the disruption with drugs, then what happens is the circuits in the amygdala, the extended amygdala, become almost too sensitive, or they can be affected in a way that in the long run, it's totally dysregulated. And so, again, we're talking about a disruption in the neurotransmitter process. And then we've got the prefrontal cortex, and that's that part of the brain that helps you solve problems. It helps you control yourself, control the impulsive thoughts and behaviors that you want to do. And that part of the brain is constantly changing and developing through a lot of your life. That part of the brain is not fully developed in teens, for instance. That's why they have a hard time not being impulsive. And the disruption in the prefrontal cortex is the reason that we discuss that people who are hardcore drug addicts, they disrupt that process, they disrupt that growth through the drugs. And so there's this concept in addiction where people say, oh yeah, you pick back up where you started the addiction to the drugs in terms of age and maturity. And that has a lot to do with the fact that if you're a serious drug user and an addict, you are affecting the prefrontal cortex portion of the brain. Now, let me get back to this whole dopamine thing. So the dopamine signal, it is what's responsible for those euphoric feelings, those good feelings, the pleasure. And so what you're doing is creating, when you take substances or perform habits, do behaviors that constantly push that dopamine response, okay, the neurotransmitters, when you constantly seek out euphoria and when you disrupt that signal. And so we've got two things going on. You can disrupt and enhance that signal in a way that is unhealthy and can almost stretch out and damage the neurons, or you can on a regular basis get your body and your brain used to seeking out those pleasure signals that the dopamine is responsible for. So you're either causing damage or you're creating habits. Now, to say that you are going to do a dopamine cleanse makes absolutely no sense, because your body, your brain, you're going to create dopamine. It's there. The way that it's being fired, the way that it's being used is what becomes a problem. And so what happens also in addiction or just unhealthy habits of seeking out pleasure, and again, it's not that you can never seek out pleasure. It becomes a problem when that's all you're seeking out. Your life becomes about seeking out instant gratification. Everybody knows that word. When you misuse, and then over here where you disrupt it, what happens is there's a combination of you are disrupting the process and you're training your brain to seek out that instant gratification. And you're creating surges of dopamine. And so you can't get rid of the dopamine, but you can create habits in your life, thoughts in your life make sure that you regulate the things that you're putting into your body so that your brain gets into a regular, normal, healthy, functioning system of releasing the dopamine. We don't want to release too much dopamine, and we don't want to release not enough dopamine. And you do have control over that process in the long run based on your habits, based on your thoughts, based on a whole host of things that we are figuring out and discussing in the mental health world. When people say that they're addicted to dopamine, I get it. I think a better discussion is, hey, I'm seeking out instant gratification. Now, if we want to talk about the fact that dopamine is involved in the process of making you feel good, that's fine. But I think our focus should more be on what I often hear. I like conversations about instant gratification and reducing the amount of instant gratification so that in the long run, you can make sure that you find pleasure out of less stimulating triggers. What we know in terms of dopamine and pleasure is that when you eliminate or reduce seeking out instant gratification constantly, whether that be through drugs or that be through certain behaviors, what happens, interestingly, is after a long period of that, your brain gets used to finding pleasure in little things. So, for instance, an addict who has been seeking out this instant gratification, and they get off drugs, and then they're still seeking out instant gratification without their drugs. They have lowered somewhat the flooding of dopamine. However, they are still participating in that. And that's why when people talk about, I need a fix, I need to smoke so that I don't relapse, or I need to do these things that, again, are all about that surge of dopamine. Even though in the moment it feels like the right thing to do, it isn't the right thing to do. In the long run, you are setting yourself up to continue the unhealthy teaching of the brain, so to speak. What you want to do is you want to reduce. It's not that you can never experience instant gratification. That's an important process too. And so we don't want to completely eliminate the idea of I can never feel instantly gratified. It's just within reason and every once in a while. And so somebody who's been is newly in recovery has a really hard time with things like boredom, because their brain has been taught to only feel stimulated when there are these major either behaviors or substances that provide this major surge of dopamine. And so you have to teach your brain to function and to find pleasure in smaller things. And so I can remember one conversation with a client that I was working with. They were probably 2 or 3 years into recovery. And I can remember them telling me, oh my gosh, it was the weirdest thing. I was just watching my niece play. And normally I would have been so bored and irritable, but somehow, some way, I found so much pleasure. And we had this big discussion about it, because in that moment, what I helped this client to see is that there were probably a lot of moments like that happening that they weren't really engaged with and participating. Well, they were participating, but they weren't paying attention to. That's the word I'm looking for. They weren't paying attention to how many times they were finding little pieces of joy, little pieces of stimulation throughout their day. And once I started helping them find those little pieces, they were just totally blown away. They go, oh my gosh, I was living in a world for so many years that I couldn't enjoy because my brain didn't know how to enjoy it. And that's true. Absolutely. And so this is why I don't like the idea of a dopamine cleanse. Cleanses are abrupt. There's something you do to your body to almost instantly, right? We're not looking for instant responses, to instantly fix whatever the heck is going on. And I'm telling you, you can do a dopamine cleanse and drastically change your life all you want, take out all the stimulation. I don't know how you would do that, but you can take out all the stimulation. I've heard as people saying, do it for a week. I've heard some people saying, do it for a month. But at the end of the day, The only way to teach your brain is to do things on a consistent basis for many months, many years. And like in this case with my client, it took about 3 years for them to truly start experiencing a brain that could seek out and experience normal pleasure. And that's the problem with addiction. It's abusing the pleasure center of the brain. Now, there's this other concept that I actually like, but it doesn't do a great job of defining what's actually going on in the brain. And so that's rewiring of the brain. I use that term all the time because I think it communicates very well how we need to think in order to make changes that we want to make in our life. And so when I talk about rewiring the brain, I'm talking about systematically teaching your brain to have different habits and seek things out. I'm talking about literally changing and healing these neurotransmitter processes. What I like to tell people is think about a hiking hill or mountain. You've got various trails. And so when you do a behavior and think one way long enough, you kind of start to clear out this trail. And if it's healthy thinking and healthy neurotransmissions, then you create this almost pathway, this hiking trail, and your brain gets used to it. It becomes an even flowing, easy flow. Now, it's all surface level. I want you to think about a pathway that can easily get grown over, right? When you go hiking, you can have a trail, and then if there's a big rain, it kind of grows over, but you can kind of see the trail and you can clear it out. And just by going up and down it, it gets cleared out and it stays like that. That's kind of the way that the brain functions. Not exactly, but it's a good picture of how to think of it when you're trying to change depression or addictive behaviors or obsessive thoughts. And so what happens with addiction is you don't have this light trail. You actually have a trail, and then the more you keep going down it, you almost dig because there's so much abuse of the neurotransmitters. What happens is you almost dig way down into the earth, right? So it's not just a trail, it's almost a canyon. Like it can get grown over to some extent, but because you've actually dug down and created a trench, that's the word I'm looking for, because you've created a trench, not just a hiking trail, if you reach that point in the brain, what happens is it's not going to go away completely ever, and it's always going to be easily cleared. So if it's an unhealthy pathway, you don't want it to be there. And so, for instance, with addiction, when you get into recovery, the reason people can relapse so easily once they take that drug again or participate in that behavior again is because they've dug a trench, so to speak, in terms of those neural processes in the brain. You get into recovery and you start changing and you make healthy pathways, and that pathway does get grown over, but the trench is still there. So you don't have to utilize that pathway, but you've got to remember that if you've done that much damage, the trench is going to be there, and we say it's going to be there for life. It can be something that you don't see, that you don't use, that your brain doesn't rely on, but it's not going to be hard for the brain to clear out that pathway. You've got a constant maintenance because healthy behaviors never dig a trench like that, but you've got healthy behaviors that continually clear out the pathway. And then when a storm hits, so to speak, or something really difficult, it might get a little bit cloudy and a little bit difficult to see the trail. But if you continue the habits, you continue the routines, your brain very quickly uncovers those healthy pathways. And so I like that analogy because it's how the brain works. It's not exactly what's going on physically in the brain, but it's what we're talking about as mental health professionals when we say rewire the brain. Now, again, it's not a big deal that people are talking about dopamine addiction. And again, some of it's okay because it gets people doing some healthy things in their life. However, I think that anytime you're not discussing something in the right way, you leave room for some unhealthy adaptations of that information. And so in this case, what I see that's unhealthy is anytime people talk about a cleanse, they're looking for instant fixes, and that's not how the brain works. You cannot detox your brain. You can slowly and consistently build healthy habits. You can change the way that neurotransmitters are released from an unhealthy release to a healthy release. You can participate in changing those different parts of the brain that I mentioned earlier. You can do things that actually physically damage parts of your brain that can or cannot be healed. But none of this has anything to do with a detox. And again, if my mind's thinking detox, I'm thinking quick fix, and I would rather people think long, systematic, healthy routines. And I'm seeing this with specifically a lot of life coaches and influencers online. And then I've had people kind of talking to me about it. And anybody that can motivate you to do better in your life, I'm all for. And sometimes life coaches have some amazing concepts to teach, but be careful, because when we're dealing with mental health, we really need to get back to discussing, if you've heard my podcast before, utilizing theory to treat people. And then we need to get back to making sure that we're doing our research, that we're talking about things in an accurate way, both for ourselves and for the clients that we are trying to help. And what we have with therapists who are licensed, we have a board that makes sure that we do that. And the problem with influencers and life coaches is they can say and do whatever they want. They don't ever have to be held accountable. And a lot of times that's fine. They don't do damage, but sometimes they're causing damage. And I don't think they do it purposely, but they're causing damage and there's nobody to check them. There's nobody that holds them accountable. And it's funny because I've had a few conversations with life coaches who have a great life and have overcome things. And so because they're doing things that work in their life, they now have decided that they have the authority to tell other people to duplicate what they're doing in their life. That's the big difference between a life coach and a therapist. A therapist is practicing, hopefully, based on research, and a life coach is taking their own experiences and trying to pass them on to people. But when it comes to addiction, really stick with the professionals. That's a really hard thing because addiction is such a big world, and a lot of times you're getting help and care from people who simply were able to overcome addiction in their own lives. And that's great. There's a need for that piece and support in the addiction world. But we really also need to stick to the science. We need to understand and practice helping clients based on the science. I hope I didn't make too many people angry, and if it helps you to think of things in terms of a dopamine addiction and a dopamine cleanse, that's fine. But I hope I kind of cleared things up. I hope that my description and explanation of the brain processes wasn't too confusing. And I like this discussion. I hope that we keep talking about this because let's be honest, addiction is something that has affected everybody's life. There's nobody alive these days, at least in modern society, who is not affected either themselves or somebody that they loved by addiction. So with that, I hope that you start doing the research. I hope that you take the time to truly understand how addiction affects the brain, how addiction affects families, and how it's affecting our society.
The Hope for Parents with Struggling Teens podcast is an Inspired Resolutions production. Hosted by Brandon Jaffe. Edited and mixed by Natalie Atkinson. Music by Natalie and Sean Atkinson. Inspired Resolutions Counseling is based in Yorba Linda, California. Whether you're interested in joining our group, seeking therapy services, or exploring more of our resources, you can find us on our website, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube at Inspired Resolutions Counseling.